has come along very well, and we'll have a lot to review there with you today. We also have initial information on the use of the corridor. So I think in the last meeting or previous meetings, we talked a lot about the survey that was open that was taking information on trip analysis. So we've got some results on that I think you'll find very interesting, and what folks are saying about what that pricing could look like. So we've got some initial reaction for users, and what that pricing could look like. You know, we don't have any kind of range on the toll prices yet. That's going to come in the next meeting. But it was really interesting to see kind of how users chose whether or not they were willing to pay to be in an express lane. And so all of this information is still preliminary. I know I've got another community meeting tonight. We won't be sharing all of this with the community meetings yet because we have some refinements that we're still doing, and we'll be presenting to you later. But this is really important that you start to see where this preliminary information is and can provide some input and what other things, you know, we need to advance to a more full evaluation, especially related to trade-offs. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from the team today and engaging in some discussion with you all about these trade-offs and what you're seeing, and if it matches what your thinking is, or any other input you might have as we continue to move forward with this project. So thank you all again. And at this point, I will turn it over to Cameron for the traffic information.
Very good. Very good. Move to the next slide there. Good morning. Thanks for being here, and thanks, Lindsay. I appreciate the introduction here. As she said, we're going to walk through today a progression of the development of some of these concepts for the corridor. And as we look to develop those ideas or those solutions, it always begins with defining the problem. And in our case, the problem we're trying to solve is how we accommodate traffic, both today traffic, as well as what we think the future traffic will be on the corridor, and relieve that congestion for the long term. So this process begins with understanding what's happening with existing traffic. And just given the events of the last year and kind of the unprecedented times that we're in, quite frankly, we continually get a lot of questions about the impact of COVID on traffic. And we now have some data that we think help explains what has been happening, and what we see in terms of trends, at least moving forward here. So the simple answer to the question of COVID's impact is that it has had an impact, but it is rebounding. It hasn't returned all the way to pre-pandemic levels yet, but let me use this graph to kind of explain the trends that we're seeing. So what you see on this is daily traffic, and this is taken at a specific point in the corridor just to the south of 135th Street. There's a continuous counter that's there, so we have very good granular data of what that looks like. And this shows the trends by month of the year, so January through December. The various colors represent different years. So 2018, that data is shown in yellow, 2019 in blue, etc. And 2018 and 2019, not surprisingly, you see some similar patterns there. But 2020 obviously looks very different. If you look at the beginning of the year, traffic was actually increasing in this corridor in the early part of 2020. But obviously with the onset of the pandemic and the stay-at-home orders and everything, this dramatic drop, a 42% drop in daily traffic over the course of March and April. So kind of bottomed out in April. And then as things started to get a little bit better, as some of the stay-at-home orders were lifted and those sort of things, we saw, again, a pretty pronounced dramatic rebound up into June that put us back into that range of being between 50 and 60,000 cars a day in this one particular in this one particular location. From June through October, we started to see, you know, more incremental, slight changes, slight ticks up in that traffic. But then in October, second wave of the pandemic was upon us, and we started to see some more pullback and some further restrictions. So it started to drop off again. So far this year, what we see is represented by the gray line, and we only really have a couple of months worth of data there. But I would expect that as we start to see cases continuing to decline, as more and more people get vaccinated, we're going to continue to monitor that. And I expect that that will start to trend back towards the levels of traffic that we saw back in the 2018, 2019 timeframe. So just to put that all in perspective, if you look at it right now, traffic is rebounding, but it's still down on a daily basis about 6% from where we were post-pandemic. So wanted to kind of take you through that. We'll continue to monitor this, and we should have new information every month as that comes in. Let me move to the next slide.
Cameron,
Mhm.
Clint had a question. Do you believe the capacity of that roadway versus actual? What do you believe the capacity of that roadway to be actual? Are you going to get to that, or can you address that?
I'm going to show that, but if you look at, just as a general rule, if you look at a 4-lane roadway, it can handle somewhere in the range of about 70 to 75,000 cars on a daily basis before you start seeing big slowdowns. So that's kind of a general rule. And I actually have that shown on another slide here in a second. Okay, so we have good understanding, I think, of existing traffic and what it's doing and how the rebound from COVID is progressing. But the real question is, what do we expect to happen in the future? And to understand future traffic levels, you have to first understand how is the region planned to grow. So over the last several months, our team's been working with Mid-America Regional Council and other partners to understand the planned land use and the anticipated growth trends for the larger Kansas City metro area, for Johnson County, and the area that's immediately around the US 69 corridor. To illustrate that trend, we wanted to share the projections for Johnson County. And the reason we chose that is the US 69 serves a blend of, I'll say, regional trips, but also a heavy volume of Oval and Park trips. And that combination, we think, is represented with the Johnson County data. So as shown here on the screen, this planned growth is strong. I mean, as you can see in the table, from a population standpoint, expected to increase by almost 40% by 2050. And from an employment standpoint, it's even stronger, with a nearly 50% more jobs in Johnson County by 2050 as there were in 2015. So this planned growth will increase traffic. And on the next slide, I'm going to show you how that translates into forecasted traffic. We'll go to the next slide. Okay, so with the planned growth that I just took you through, what does this mean specifically for 69? So there's a lot on this slide, so I want to walk you through this and how we estimate what the traffic will be, and then again, and then what our team is doing to account for some uncertainty in what the future looks like from a traffic perspective. So to orient you to this screen, along the bottom is our years from 1990 to 2050, and along the left side are traffic volumes that we're experiencing in that segment between 135th Street and Blue Valley. So this exhibit can be sort of divided into two halves, where you see the blue line down the center. To the left side of this is history, what's happened in the corridor over the last 30 years. And as you can see, this particular section grew from 30,000 to nearly 90,000 cars per day. And to Clint's point that he just made, I want to draw your attention to that heavy black line that's just under 80,000 cars a day, between 75 and 80,000. That threshold represents where a 4-lane freeway begins to break down and experience some significant congestion. So as you can see, this particular section just south of Blue Valley Parkway crossed that threshold in the 2012 timeframe, started to get up into that range, maybe a little later than that, 2015, which I doubt is really a surprise to anybody that uses this corridor with any sort of regularity. As we look to the right is looking into the future as to what we think the traffic growth will look like. And there is uncertainty with that. Any forecast is a look into the future, and we don't know what that's going to look like for certain. The red line that's on there, that red dotted line, is what corresponds to the regional growth projections that I just took you through. So if we look at how the planned land use and the planned growth in the corridor, it would suggest that by 2050 we grow from where we are today at the mid 80,000 range up to about 120,000 in that area. The thing that I want to point out with that is if that becomes reality, that represents a slower rate of growth than what we have experienced in the corridor over the last 30 years. You can see that inflection where that rate is a little slower. We have to decide whether we think that that's the right forecast or not. So to account for that, we are looking at a range. We're saying on that red line will be our baseline that we base a lot of our forecasts on because it's consistent with how the region is planned to grow. But we're going to also look at a high growth scenario where we get essentially back to that same rate of growth that we experienced over the last several decades. And then we'll also look at a lower rate of growth that, say, accounts for if there are a greater number of people that, say, are working from home and other factors like that that could actually suggest a lower impact of traffic growth in the corridor. So I said a mouthful there. I'm going to take a pause and see if there's any questions with that.
There was another question in the chat. What percentage do you believe the portion of OP versus outside OP will be that 146,000?
So the 146,000, I'd have to look into that percentage split. We do have some information though on the makeup of the existing traffic that is there. And it's roughly 50-50 in terms of trips that I would say are inside of Overland Park, that begin and end in Overland Park, versus trips that might originate from some other location and use the corridor. So right now it's about a 50-50 split. Have to look into how that might shift a little bit in the future, but that's gives you a sense of that split as of right now.
And I just wanted to echo one of the points that Cameron made here. We have seen in the past a growth beyond the projections. Mm-hmm. And so we, historically in previous studies have sort of underestimated the growth in this corridor. And so, we have a lot of questions from the public about, well, now due to COVID, are you seeing less traffic? We've kind of answered that question with the very first slide. And now, we have to set a growth rate to do projections and forecasting. So we think it makes a lot of sense given COVID is an unknown factor, as well as, this region really outpacing previous projections. We know that doing a range makes a lot of sense for this. And I did see that Greg had a comment in the chat.
Yep.
So Cameron, I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, Greg, I see your comment. Your comment's a very good one about the planning for what Southern Johnson County looks like has evolved a bit, and the intention is for that to develop in a less dense way. I would tell you that is the primary factor in why that rate going forward is projected to be a lower growth rate than just continuing on at the same pace as what it has been. So the short answer is yes, that's taken into account in the regional growth. All right, let's move on to the next slide then. Okay, so what I just kind of took you through was one representative location. It was that location that was in between Blue Valley Parkway and 135th Street. But we do this not just in one location, but we look at that across the corridor at a number of representative locations, which are shown here on the map and in that table. And as you might expect, in the northern part of the corridor near 435, say, this area already has high traffic levels and is mostly developed around those locations. And so as a percentage basis, the increases are lower. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you go down to the south near 179th Street, say, at location 6 there. Those are where the existing volumes are pretty low. And we're not projecting those to reach 120,000 vehicles a day or anything in that area. So as a percentage, it's a big growth number from a percentage basis. I think that the last thing I want to say about these, again, just reiterating that these are all consistent with Mid-America Regional Council's regional model, and that our this is the foundation of our baseline forecast, but as Lindsay mentioned, we will be evaluating both high and low growth scenarios. But this gives you a snapshot of where we are projecting the traffic to grow as we look out to that 2050 timeframe. Any other questions on this? Okay, let's go on to the next slide then. Okay, so we understand the existing traffic, we understand how the region is planned to grow, and we forecasted what impact that growth is going to have on traffic on US 69 as we look out to the year 2050. So the next step is to evaluate what improvements are needed to accommodate that future traffic. So our team has been developing a variety of different options for doing that. We've looked at both conventional and both conventional toll-free concepts, as well as concepts that incorporate express lanes that we've spent a lot of time here talking about with you all. And we've essentially narrowed this to two concepts that we want to walk through with you today, one toll-free concept and one express lanes concept. And as you'll see, these concepts, they improve congestion. They both improve congestion over what's experienced today, but they do handle traffic with some differences and have some different pros and cons that we want to take a look at over the long term. I'm going to flip to the next slide. Okay, so we've said many times throughout our time with you all, one of the primary purposes of this project is to relieve congestion. And the real question is, what's the best way to do that, both near term and long term? So I want to walk you through what our analysis is telling us about the differences in how toll-free solutions and express lane solutions address this congestion. So if we start at the top of this graphic and thinking about existing US 69, there are two lanes in each direction, and they're obviously not tolled, they're not managed in any way. They're two general purpose lanes. Those two lanes during the peak periods of the day with 2019 traffic routinely have speeds that drop to 15 miles an hour per less. This is the congestion problem that we are trying to solve, and this is what causes the longer travel times and unpredictable trips. So we then looked at what happens if we add another lane in each direction and then apply those 2050 traffic volumes that I just walked through, and we apply that to those lanes. And we looked at it in two different ways. The middle set of bars on this graphic illustrate how the system will perform if we add another general purpose lane, not an express toll lane. And what we see is that by 2050, all three of the lanes start to experience some slowdowns to about 40 miles per hour. This is clearly better than what's out there today, a lot higher than the 15 miles per hour that we see today. But at 40 miles an hour, this is still a performance level that's maybe below what we would like to see. And because all of the lanes operate similarly, there's no option for a higher speed trip. The only option for improving speeds beyond what we're suggesting here is to continue to add lanes beyond just the 6-lane US 69. So if we consider a different approach where the additional capacity is added as an express toll lane, the bars on the bottom illustrate how that performs differently. And as you can see, because we're able to manage the number of vehicles that use the express lane, again, using a variable pricing to regulate the number of users that are in those lanes, we can manage the speed of the express lane at a higher level and ensure a faster, more reliable trip. The toll-free lanes do see some reduction in speed, but because there's now an option for a higher speed, more reliable trip, and the users have the choice to make that option, we feel there's less need to continue building out more and more lanes under the express toll lane solution. So again, both of these options improve it over what's there today, certainly. I mentioned with the toll-free solution that the resulting performance, maybe not being quite what we would like to see and is slower. The way that you improve that is to add additional lanes. And in the next couple slides, I'm going to kind of show a comparison of how those concepts differ. But I want to pause there for a second because we've said a mouthful and see if there's any questions on what we're suggesting here.
Ron's got a question in the chat.
Yeah.
The average speed analysis is interesting. Are you anticipating a difference in induced demand for the toll-free versus toll lanes?
So the projection that we've done here for this the short answer is no. We're essentially using the same traffic volumes and just showing how do the two different solutions handle that same volume differently. So we're not suggesting a different induction of demand with this analysis. I will say, maybe off to the side on that, one phenomenon that you do see with express lanes is because of that, it is a more effective tool in actually spreading out the peak periods of the day too. Whereas if it's all general purpose, folks use that very similarly to how they use the roadway today. But express lanes and being able to apply that pricing and they have that value proposition every time they get on the roadway of whether to use the express lanes or not. That pricing component gives you one more tool to help spread the traffic over a longer period of the day and reduce the how pronounced those peaks are.
Cameron, could I ask a question? This is Adam.
Yeah.
So, I know you use somewhere you have a formula for calculating this. In the areas you're talking about, your more affluent communities, I'm wondering if there aren't more and more people in those communities who would say, look, I see those cars whizzing by me on the left. I'm going to put in my dollar and get this trip covered. And I'm just wondering if that happens, if you have a more affluent community where more people are willing to pay the extra to get on the express toll lane, if these numbers are actually accurate. And I think about when I go to KCI and paying for the, I forget what it's called, I have Global Traveler, but whatever it is to get through the fast lane. And sometimes going through the fast lane is slower now than it is to go through without my TSA approval. And I see that in a number of airports where I go that now too many people have paid for that. And I'm just wondering, with the average income level in South Johnson County, if this is actually, if there are that many people are going to remain in those two lanes going 35, and if they jump into the 55, then all of them are back to 40. And we haven't actually made things better, even though we have a toll lane.
So I love this question. And when we get to some of the information that is product from the traveler preference survey, what you will see in that is you'll see how folks' willingness to pay changes based on income level and based on how the price is set. And so based on that, it would indicate that we have a good sense of folks' willingness to pay, but that there are price points that would prevent us from getting to that scenario that you just described, where everybody wants to be in the express lane, and as a result, it doesn't actually have the intended benefit. So I guess if you don't mind, let's maybe come back to this once we present that piece of it a little bit later.
And there are a couple other questions in the chat. Greg had a question regarding the variable pricing, and is there a percentage of vehicles that are anticipated to be in the toll lane that does the variable pricing determine that? You sort of addressed it, but
yeah,
really the same question as Adam's, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, the idea is that the pricing that's applied to the lane based on the level of congestion in essentially real time is what helps ensure that you have the right amount of people that are in the lane, so that it's well used, but not so full that it reduces the performance of the lane. But that's one of the reasons why the pricing is so sensitive, is you have to find that right balance that you get the performance that you want, but still the benefit that you want.
And another question about the impact of, have you considered the impact of adding additional mass transit on the roadway speeds?
Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit more about that when Gretchen gets into some of the alternatives analysis here. The short response on that is we have evaluated some transit options. The options that we feel are realistic here on US 69 are more centered on improving bus operations and things like that, as opposed to, say, a light rail or some sort of system like that. So we do have some information to talk about there. Okay, all good questions. Really appreciate it. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so when we were walking through this, I started to say that as we look at a general purpose solution and the performance, of all the lanes being in that 40 mile per hour range, if we want to try and improve that with a general purpose solution, really the way that you can go about that is to start adding additional capacity or additional lanes beyond what just a 6-lane roadway would provide. But that's not necessarily the case in all parts of the corridor. So I'm going to walk through 3 example locations that show the similarities and differences between the toll-free concept and the express toll lanes concept. So starting down towards the south, this is a representative section of what it could look like just north of 159th Street. And as you can see here, the 2 options really have a very similar footprint in this location. The difference between them is just the inside lane is an express lane in one concept versus just another general purpose lane in the other. The footprint's not necessarily different here because in this location, the traffic volumes are lower and there's more space between the interchanges. So it's not a lot of difference. If we go to the next slide. So however, if we move to the north, that's not the case. This starts to change. And in this slide, this shows an anticipated section between 135th Street and Blue Valley Parkway, where there's more traffic than there is to the south. And you can see from this exhibit that the footprint of the toll-free concept is starting to grow. It's larger and has more lanes than the express lanes concept. And let me help explain why that's the case. So in the toll-free concept, to handle, if you think about this section between 135th Street and Blue Valley, to handle the traffic that's coming on from those interchanges and going to the other interchange, these separate parallel lanes are needed in order to handle the traffic without impeding the through lanes. And these are called collector distributor roads, those additional lanes that are outside the basic 6-lane roadway. If you think about a good way to picture this concept is to think about what I-435 looks like between, say, Quivira and US 69, or to think about what 435 looks like between Rowe and Knoll, where there's those separated lanes that handle the traffic between the interchanges. With the express lane concept, however, those CD roads aren't needed. In our last advisory group meeting, we talked about a revised concept in this area that provides direct ramps from the express lanes to and from Blue Valley Parkway. And what that does is instead of having all of the traffic seeking those destinations, weaving in those outside lanes, some of that traffic is able to use those direct ramps and it pulls the traffic out of those weaves. And because of that, you can have a much more compact footprint in this location.
So I want to pause there just because we have heard some discussion around how the express toll lane would work for Blue Valley Parkway and how people could get out of the express lane and over to exit there. And when we did use some of the data from the trip analysis to see just how many trips were exiting Blue Valley Parkway. Maybe they're even entering at 135th Street and then exiting at Blue Valley Parkway. And so in order to make that express toll lane work for the people that want to get off, you both have to have an exit from the general purpose lanes and from the express toll lane. And so that's why Cameron, we've adjusted the way the concept looks for how that express toll lane would work, especially at Blue Valley Parkway, because of that quick weave need. And so I just want to pause there and really emphasize that point because I know that there have been concerns about what that would look like. Okay.
All right, let's move on to the next slide here. Okay, so the last location that I want to just highlight is north of 435. So this has some similarities to what we just looked at near the 135th Street interchange, where the toll-free concept has a larger footprint. And in this location, the difference is really in the northbound direction. Comparing the 2 sections, you see again, the toll-free concept has the addition of this collector distributor road in the northbound direction. What we're finding is that there's less need for the CD road in an express lane solution because the traffic in the outside lanes, while it does experience some slowdowns in some locations, it does not impede the express lane and eliminate the ability to provide that higher speed, more reliable trip. So this is also a location where there's some pretty real impacts of this CD road network, which is what I want to show on the next slide. You go to the next slide, Kelsey. Okay, so that previous slide was a section just north of 435, and we're now looking at that same area just with a plan view, a top-down look at it. So 69 runs up and down in yellow there, with 435 running east-west on the screen. If you look at the toll-free solution on the left, that CD road network, the blue roadways that are running parallel to the yellow main line, you can see that kind of running north in the northbound direction. That pink box indicates a building, a business that would be impacted by this solution, would have to be purchased. Conversely, if you look at the express lanes concept on the right side, it does not need that CD road and is able to stay within the existing right-of-way. So if we look collectively at the express lane solution versus the toll-free solution, the smaller footprint has some advantages. It's obviously less expensive to build initially, has a smaller footprint, and would have reduced impacts on some of the surrounding properties. And over the long haul, the cost of maintaining some of the additional infrastructure with the toll-free concept, it adds up. It's a perpetual cost that has to be accounted for. From a congestion management perspective, the two options handle traffic differently, but the express lanes option really provides that opportunity to always provide that higher speed, more reliable trip without the need for continuing to add more and more lanes. So I know we've covered a lot there. I want to take another pause and answer some questions. I will say, you know, we are introducing a lot of this information to you guys here today. When we meet again, we'll have much more information on cost and phasing and other things that we know are certainly factors that go into thinking this through. But we wanted to at least get you guys a little more familiar with the differences we're seeing in these options.
Hey,
Thanks, Cameron. And
I've always thought Blue Valley Parkway wasn't really how it merges onto 69 was a very good design. I hope I'm not insulting you if that's yours, but I
was about negative 30 years old when that was constructed.
Well, that's okay then. You get a pass. But is it appropriate to add such a high cost because of Blue Valley Parkway's bad merging and simply terminating Blue Valley Parkway and not creating that alternate from the toll lane over and or the merge over to the far side to get to 135th? It just seems like a high cost for a bad situation to begin with.
So I want to make sure I'm following kind of what you were describing there. The biggest issue that comes from the 135th Street in the southbound direction is obviously the left-hand entrance. And, you know, as we look at the origin destination data, it is surprising the number of people that are getting on there and froggering their way all the way across and getting off at 135th Street. With any of the concepts that I think we're looking at, we would want to make sure that the traffic that wants to do that is accommodated on the right instead of going all the way across the lanes. There are some costs associated with continuing to provide that movement. I think it'd be up for some debate, but I will say it's usually a difficult conversation to talk about removing access that's already there. But
yeah,
compare the cost, there's no question that it does have a cost associated with it.
Thanks.
One point I want to make, if you could go back to the last slide. Cameron said this and then kind of jumped, but I know, you know, these additional lanes on the outside of the main line are labeled as collector distributor roads. But I think as in driving the corridor, and we already experience it now with the collector distributor roads that are already north of the previous slice that they kind of did down between 135th and Blue Valley Parkway. You know, these collector distributor roads exist already And when you're driving it, you don't consider yourself not part of the highway at that point. So literally, when you're looking at this toll-free concept, you're looking at, you know, this many lanes of highway infrastructure. They're labeled collector distributor and not, you know, general purpose lanes as far to the main line there in the middle. But when you're driving it, you're driving on a, how many lanes is that? 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 lane facility at full build out. And so I just really wanted everybody to understand, you know, there's breaks here because of the uses of those roads. But in actuality, when you're operating through there, it's going to be that large. And that's why you have then on the next slide, that impact on the right of way that, you know, would be a, you know, an opportunity potentially with the toll solution to not have that right of way impact, because you do have to acquire so much more right of way for the collector distributor, additional lanes to manage the traffic.
All right, very good. Well, I think, like I said, there'll be more to come on this, but if you want to flip to the next piece of this, what we really want to know is obviously, I think the cost of the toll and what it's going to cost to take certain trips on the corridor is going to be important for everyone as we kind of wrestle through this. But our team wants to know what other information is important to you as you're kind of personally looking at these options and trying to understand what you think is a better way to, what is the better way to improve this roadway. So we want to get your feedback through Minty here and get your input on what you'd like to see the next time we meet.
So just as a reminder, you go to the minty.com in another browser and use the code 17232610, and you all are getting it, and then that will populate the screen. And for those that selected other, you know, be thinking of it, either put your other in the chat or take yourself off mute and let us know what the other is.
This is Greg. I didn't do other, but I'm looking at this maybe too simplistically, but you have two solutions. One of them has a funding source and the other one does not. So what is the impact of a toll-free and the dartboard look at when it might be funded? Because that, to me, is the critical question here. Is I don't like the tolling option if we had a robust opportunity to fund it otherwise, but we don't. So I don't know if that's built into the cost or what, but when do we get it if we don't have a toll? When might we get it otherwise? And I know that's dartboard stuff, but that's the first thing I think about.
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to respond. That is one thing that we are working on as we kind of continue to build out this value proposition, if you will, of the options. And I just wanted to say we're working on it, and we're trying to narrow the dartboard down or increase the size of our dart. I'm not sure exactly, but trying to get there to get you an answer on that particular point, Greg. Okay, sorry, Tom, go ahead.
All I was going to say is mine is tied, my other is tied to 5, but it's more specific in the dialogues that I've had. And it comes around to the environmental sound noise, that the belief is when you add a toll, you add an expressway, faster speed, how are those things being mitigated or managed? And as Julie Brewer mentioned last time, litter and those types of things. I don't think that there's a in the conversations that I'm having in opposition to the need, it's going to be there regardless, a little bit to what Greg said, regardless of whether we do or do not do something. But when we encourage faster and more traffic, it has these other mitigating issues out there, and still understanding what the plan is to address those. And I know in our conversations last time, you said studies are being done. We're looking at those things and just not ready to share them. But you wanted context to why I put other, that's why I put other.
Again.
Lindsay, do you want to address Julie's comment in the on the status of the tolling authority issue that
Yeah. I think, her comment here, just for those of you that haven't seen it, is, can an update on the debate in Topeka be given on the tolling authority issue? I may be a little behind. We did try to do a little bit of a cleanup to allow ourselves a couple more options this year in Topeka, but there's a couple of debates in Topeka. And so I'm going to use that broad opportunity to bring one other thing up that's being considered, especially given the discussion around funding availability. We have the cleanup bill is not going to prevent either of these options, or I guess the lack of progress on the cleanup bill. So we don't need to concern ourselves. Everything that we need to do, we can do under current law. And the questions that were raised as part of the cleanup, I think, centered more on not having an example project, not having a community bring forward the request, more so than, a resistance overall to tolling. The other piece I want to bring up is, as the legislature is continuing on this session, there have been lots of discussions around tax cuts. There's also a lot of discussion at the federal level about infrastructure and, sort of the rescue plan and what those funds are going to offer as far as opportunities under infrastructure. And so we're weighing a lot of those things right now. The nice thing about the way we are trying to bring forward this project is that we have alternative delivery as a method to construct. So that's going to offer us a little bit of flexibility. If additional money came into the pie, or the pie grew larger, we could potentially build additional projects. And that's why we're working to clear the entire corridor from 103rd to 179th Street with this study, so that we have the full corridor, concept ready in case there's additional money that becomes available. But we are really, in the stuff that we've already laid out for you and are continuing to discuss, wanting you to see some of the other operational pieces besides just revenue for really how this manages congestion over the long term. So I just wanted to make that point, maybe with a few too many words. Sorry about that.
Thanks, Lindsay. I think Ron noted, one of the reason he put other was the trade-offs, the differential impacts on the adjacent roadway network, and the induced demand was one of the reasons there. We have a couple other questions in the chat that, do we want to address those, Cameron, here? Or do we need to?
I would say, if it's okay, Julie, I might circle back on your question here down the line so that we get to some of our other content, but I think you have a good one that we'll want to circle back on, and ties into some of the things that we're going to do in our next, or what we have planned to show in our next time together. I'd say kick it over to Gretchen.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to switch gears just a little bit and kind of talk a little bit more about where we have just left off with some of the environmental analysis we're doing. If you recall from last meeting when we were here, we talked some about the 6 potential kind of initial range of alternatives that we had for the project. And then we introduced some potential screening criteria we're going to use to do the initial screening of those. And so wanted to do a quick refresher on those 6 alternatives you see on the screen that we looked at, that first being the no build, which is, a requirement that we carry forward, a no action that really doesn't look at capacity or reconstruction. It just incorporates anything that's already planned or committed along the corridor. So that's always something that we'll have kind of as a benchmark for comparison. Then we had an improvement to alternate routes. And if you recall what that was really saying, what if we didn't change the capacity or improve the 69 corridor, but we looked at things we could do on adjacent corridors such as Metcalf or Schweitzer, Quivira, Antioch, and focused there instead. And what we said with that one was it would take city county support, transit support if we wanted to do improvements or capacity there instead. But that was something we wanted to look at before we made the major investment in 69. Another one we had was existing capacity management. And what we really looked at there was ways to either manage the demand through carpooling or other kind of different commuting time strategies, or things that were technology or intelligent transportation system related, where maybe we'd use other traveler information, or whether it's different things we could do with ramp metering or other technology information to help people inform on their trip. And then we looked at things like multimodal, which included the transit that Cameron touched on a little earlier. And when we said multimodal for this, we really are more focused on those bus strategies. And so whether it's increased frequency of routes, more park and rides, or bus on shoulder types of strategies, those are more the types of transit we meant, rather than say a light rail or a commuter rail type of option. And then we also looked at things we could do to improve bicycle pedestrian connections, not necessarily on 69, but possibly the adjacent trail networks or better crossings across 69 for bicycle and pedestrians. And so those were really the other alternatives that we looked at that weren't adding additional capacity. And Cameron already touched quite a bit this morning on the 2 add capacity, whether it's general purpose or express lanes. So I'm not necessarily going to touch on that right now. But as we go and switch gears here, and Kelsey, you can go ahead and change the slide. When we look at each of those alternatives at this level of screening, we're really looking at them still as standalone alternatives. On an individual basis, how do they meet the purpose and need that we've established for the project? There's still opportunities, even if we're dismissing some of those from consideration at this initial range when we show the criteria here in a minute. That doesn't necessarily mean that later we couldn't combine some of those strategies or some of those techniques and tools with the ultimate proposed action or preferred alternative that we have for the project. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're looking at this criteria. And so up here on the screen, we've kind of shown just a refresher of the categories that we talked about last time for screening criteria. And first and foremost, this initial range of screening goes through that purpose and need. And we worked with you to help establish the purpose and need for the project. We'll show that up on screen in a minute, but it's those things like improved safety, reduce congestion. And so first we're going to take all of these through that lens and look at it through that purpose and need. And then those that we think are viable to carry forward, we'll then take you through the natural and human environment, the engineering and cost components, and then this public and stakeholder input piece. And when we talk through today, you're not necessarily going to see a rating given to public and stakeholder input. That's really a chance for us to get your thoughts and opinions on, once we show this rating criteria, did we get it right? Do you see any differences in your opinion on how we rated? And then as we take it to the public meeting, we'll kind of do the same thing to offer the public some interactive ways to tell us their input on the ratings of these alternatives. On the right-hand side here, you see the rating system that we used for the project. And you can kind of see it goes from kind of the red higher impact all the way down to the green, which is more of a lower impact. And so if you think about it, kind of like a stoplight, when you're looking at it, and you're going to see the matrix here in a minute, anything you kind of see in the red is probably having a higher impact from either a natural or man-made environment standpoint. Cameron talked about the larger footprint, or it's lower at achieving, what we established as our goals for the purpose and need for the project. So when you see red, think about it that way. When you're starting to see the gray or the green, you're seeing areas where we think we're going to have lower impacts to the natural or man-made environment and a higher ability to achieve the purpose and need that we've set for this project. And so that's what those kind of mean as you kind of see those ratings, and we show them up here in just a moment. And so this is I know a lot to absorb on this matrix. I believe last time we showed you kind of a feel for what that matrix looked like. And now you can kind of see our initial ratings as we filled it in here. And just to kind of orient you here, all of the alternatives are listed on this left-hand side, all the way from our no build down to our add capacity with express toll lanes, initial alternatives. And then across the top, you see our purpose and need elements. And so you can see that improve safety, reduce congestion, promote sustainability. And so for each of those initial alternatives, we've done this initial screening. And so just at a glance, as you're kind of looking here, it's pretty clear that most of those initial alternatives that we looked at that don't add capacity to 69 didn't necessarily meet the purpose and need for the project as strongly as being able to add capacity. And that's partly because really reducing congestion and improving safety are key tenets to doing the 69 improvements. And so I'm going to walk through these at a high level. And then at the end, I'm going to have Lindsay kind of talk about some of the key trade-offs or takeaways from KDOT's perspective, when we did this rating. And so our study team got together and worked through these ratings together. And at the end of this, we'd love to have your thoughts on just, did we get it right? Or do you have other thoughts on how things could be rated? And so if you think about it from the lens of the no build alternative, we always put that on here for comparison. But that no build alternative, since we're not making any improvements to US 69, you're really going to see the red all across on that one, just because it's not making those types of improvements. So it's not meeting the purpose and need that we set for this project. When you look at so then I'm going to talk through each of the categories quickly. So from an improved safety standpoint, when we kind of compared and contrasted those alternatives from an improved safety standpoint, really we found that the capacity adding solutions offered the greatest benefits there, because the kind of safety issues we most have on this corridor are related to the stop and go, related to the congestion on the corridor, some of the queues that get formed with traffic. And so adding that capacity really allows us to improve the overall safety of the corridor and address some of the geometric issues or areas where we wanted to improve at interchanges and ramps along the corridor. And so that's why you kind of see those scoring better. From a reduced congestion standpoint, for some of the same reasons, adding lanes obviously helps with reducing congestion. So you're seeing, a better condition there for both the general purpose widening and the express toll lanes. But when we look at things like improving the alternate routes or adding multimodal transit to the corridor, we do see benefit to reducing congestion. I think that question came up a little earlier in the conversation. We did look, for instance, at transit vehicles. Could they pull traffic off of 69 and shift them so that we have overall better corridor throughput? Can we shift some traffic onto alternate routes? And so we did see some improvements for reducing congestion if we did some of those other techniques, just not quite as much of a benefit as if we're able to add that capacity. From the sustainability standpoint, this ties in really well with what Cameron was just talking about a couple slides ago about the size of the footprint and the amount of life cycle costs of maintaining additional infrastructure, our ability to have a good corridor resiliencies for the long term. And so you'll see that multimodal, for instance, offers some benefits there, just because when we're adding those multimodal components, there's the ability to add some sustainability. If we get more riders to get on the transit, we have better corridor throughput. So there's some sustainability there. As we think about the add capacity though in express toll lanes, some of those benefits are stronger related to the sustainability, related to just our ability to have some best management practices for some of the environmental stewardship components and things that we wanted to add as a part of the project. And then as we go to providing flexible choices, that one's really focused on, part of it's mode choice, and just, I have the choice of using, transit versus my own passenger vehicle and those types of things. And so multimodal scores well on this one, but it also has to do with the reason you see the express lane slightly better than general purpose here is because that managed lane, the express lane, offers the ability for more flexible choices. It could be flexible in how we choose to manage that lane, whether it's to allow certain vehicles or certain pricing. We're able to manage it, and then we're also able, if we desire to be able to accommodate transit and other strategies there. So that's how that flexible choices kind of comes into play. And then the last one under purpose and need is really focused on accommodating both the local, city, county, and the region's growth. And so we said with most of these, we're able to accommodate that growth, but in reviewing the city, the county, and the region's plans, what they're proposing for 69 or what they're proposing for the region, we found that the general capacity or the express toll lanes best fit with what is in the current regional plans or in the growth plans for the city, the county, and the region. And so I'll pause there for a moment and let Lindsay weigh in on a couple of key takeaways from the analysis that we did.
Yeah, so as we're going through this environmental analysis and we're doing these ratings, there's going to be pros and cons to even the choices that appear to pull ahead. One thing that I did take a lot of comfort in is, in previous meetings, we've shown you about the reactions from the public in different surveys or focus groups. And one of the things that they have talked about, and there's been an overwhelming support for, is doing something on the corridor, and really addressing what the issues are and what the problems that we're seeing. I feel like the public feels that as well and knows that something needs to be done. And it really reflects well here in the purpose and need rating criteria that the two capacity improvements are really going to be able to achieve that purpose and need. So that's all I would add to this one, Gretchen.
Yeah, and so on that note, when we go forward here in a minute and we look at a couple of the other things, you're going to see that based on seeing that the add capacity, general purpose, and express lanes kind of best meet our purpose and need for this project, we're really taking those two and proposing to carry those forward and show you the rest of the analysis on those as we go forward. But before that, Kelsey, if you want to go to the next slide, we did put up a Menti question here just to say, sort of, did we get it right? And so Robin, I'll let you kind of talk through this one.
Yeah, which description below best describes your reaction to the initial screening against the purpose and need? I agree with the conclusions, and the ratings are what I expected. I agree with the conclusions, but I would rate some differently. I do not agree with the conclusions, and I disagree with many of the ratings or other. And then we can talk about the other as well.
This kind of format would make elections more fun. That's all I want to say.
Well, it looks like we have some agreement, and then some ideas that you might rate them differently, which is to be expected because everyone has kind of different ways that they think about some of those things. So it doesn't look like we got it wrong completely, and there's no other there. So we'll just move on to the next section, and we have a couple more of those to do. So we'll be asking again.
So kind of as I said a little earlier, then we're going to focus in on the add capacity, general purpose, and express lanes for the rest of the discussion on the screening because we felt like they best met the purpose and need for the project. They'll still be compared back against the no build, and so we didn't necessarily show it on here, but just know that everything we do, we're kind of benchmarking it against the do nothing. And so just to kind of talk quickly through the natural and human environment, this is really looking at any impacts to the natural or man-made environment. And so one of the first categories we look at on this one is really park and community facility impacts. And so this is anything from parks that are located along the corridor and trail systems. Community facilities can be, recreational facilities, any kind of, community centers and things like that. And so we did say that the express toll lanes was slightly better for that category, just basically because of the footprint. Since it has a smaller footprint, we have less impacts. There is a couple of areas where we have minor property takings potential for a couple of parks that we'll be coordinating and working with, and trail systems. But any of that would be avoided if possible, mitigated, and then if any trails end up being impacted, we would relocate those. So that's kind of how that category came forward. From an environmental justice standpoint, and I'm going to show a follow-up graphic on the next page for this one, but environmental justice is really, again, any kind of impacts we would see to low income or minority populations. And so for this one, we found that we would have just a slight additional impact to express lanes over the general purpose. And that's mainly because of the pricing component of an express lanes project. And we wanted to take that into consideration when we thought of social equity and just access to jobs and the ability for all users to use that facility. So we'll talk about that more in just a minute. But we did feel like express toll lanes scored just slightly lower on that one. From the noise impact standpoint, and I think this came up earlier in conversation too, noise impacts is an important consideration for the project because of the additional number of lanes getting closer to properties. The noise impacts are a little bit worse for the general purpose than it would be for the express toll lanes concept. And so that's how those were rated. And then from a natural environmental impact statement, this is wrapping a whole lot of information for the NEPA process into kind of one rating at this point for the initial screening, but it includes anything from whether it's wetlands or floodplains or stream impacts, threatened and endangered species. So anything that's kind of more of the natural, we call it bugs and bunnies on the corridor. And so from that standpoint, again, it's kind of related to the smaller footprint. And so the add capacity express toll lanes rated a bit better under this category too. And as we think about those for this project, a lot of them are floodplain and stream related impacts that we'll be monitoring and looking at. Anything we impact will be mitigating for this project. And then the last criteria here is air quality, emissions, and energy impacts, which is becoming an area of great interest with the new administration, as well as just from our region from the standpoint of having good air quality and reducing emissions. And so that's an important component of what we look at. And we said that they'd rate about the same for those because they both have some of the same abilities to improve the congestion situation along the corridor, the stop and go travel. And so all of that helps with air quality and emissions. Lindsay, anything you wanted to add on this one while we're touching on this slide?
Yeah, I think, as opposed to the last purpose and need analysis on this environment analysis, it's clear that the express toll lanes do better in more of the categories than the general purpose. And, as Gretchen mentioned, a lot of that has to do with the footprint. We're not changing the amount of traffic on the corridor. It's really about how that corridor impacts the natural environment and as Gretchen calls it, the man-made environment. So I appreciate these ratings and we'll look forward to the feedback.
And maybe I should say human environment, just to clarify. And just on that note too, these are kind of still kind of qualitative ratings as we put this together. As we go forward into the environmental documentation phase, we'll actually have the quantifiable impacts, acreage, and those types of things for these environmental categories. So just wanted to make that point. As we get farther into the study, we'll still be doing that level of impact analysis. Okay, and this is the other snapshot I wanted to just show on environmental justice. And again, it's related to the low income populations here on the left side of the screen and the minority populations based on race or ethnicity on the right hand side of the screen. And so just as you're kind of looking at this, it's done by block group from a census block group standpoint. And so anything you're kind of seeing in the darker yellow, represents the low income or minority populations that are located at the block group level along our corridor. And so you can see there's a couple of areas of low income between 135th and 151st. And then from the standpoint of minority populations, there's quite a few located along the 69 corridor. And so what this is telling us is that, we do have a diverse corridor here, and we do want to take into account how we can best serve the environmental justice populations that are located along this corridor. And so one thing we'll be doing is it'll influence the type of stakeholder outreach that we'll be doing as a part of the project, just to make sure we're getting input from those environmental justice populations on our improvements for the project. And I know Robin and the team working on stakeholder engagement already has some plans and techniques in place to make sure we're hearing from those particular populations. And then the other element that we want to focus on is just the social equity involved with the project and making sure that we're thinking about the benefits and any kind of direct and indirect impacts we might have on these populations. Go to the next slide. We have a Minty question that kind of based on our natural and human environmental impact categories. Robin, do you want to take us through that one?
Yeah, it's the same type of question. What are your reactions to that? You know, do you agree with the conclusions and the ratings? And they are what I expected. I agree with the conclusions, but some of the rating, I would rate some differently. I do not agree with the conclusions, and I disagree with many of the ratings or other. And Gretchen, you know, one comment that has come in is, you know, it's curious to whether the two alternatives are really equivalent on exhaust emissions category. I assume free lanes would mean more congestion, more time on the road, more cars, and thus mean more exhaust and negative environmental impacts. Mm-hmm. Just curious. Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, I can just talk about kind of the analysis we'll do moving forward, because again, this is a little bit more of the qualitative level, and we're kind of comparing it against those 6 alternatives in the no build a little bit more. And as we go along, we will be doing a little, you know, more quantifiable analysis related to the air quality impacts of the corridor, you know, our ability to deal with greenhouse gases and emissions and things like that. And so we may see a bit more separation of the 2 alternatives once we have that quantifiable data. And so that's not, you know, that point is kind of a valid point, that there may be some minor nuances between those once we have that level of analysis complete.
Good. And does that address the other comment, or was someone else out there had an additional comment?
You know, or does the person that rated other want to talk about that, so we can make sure we think about that as we take our input and refine any analysis? All right.
Okay, well, if you're having trouble coming off mute, remember that you're there.
It looks like Tracy just weighed in.
Yeah. I'm the other, primarily with questions to drill deeper into the explanations. Okay, well, we can hold off on that for just a little bit, Tracy, if that's okay. And Gretchen can walk through some of these, and then we can answer some of those questions.
And we will ultimately kind of have a technical memorandum that will document the entire screening process. And so we're kind of showing a summary at a summary level here, but there is going to be quite a bit of background information that will, you know, be available through our environmental process to kind of help support these ratings too. So, all right, just to touch then on the last set of criteria that we're talking about here today, this engineering and cost criteria. You know, this was really focused on a lot of the stuff Cameron was talking about when he lined out those alternatives related to their footprint and the potential different right-of-way takings that might happen, the possibilities of different costs or what affects the costs on this project. And so, you know, in a nutshell, you know, I think what we found here was that the express lanes was a little stronger was a little higher rated from the engineering and cost criteria. And part of that is when we think about not just the immediate impacts of doing this through our design year, but the ability from a longer term standpoint to continue to manage an express lanes project. And so some of that just means, as we think about the long-term implications of adding additional infrastructure and the costs associated with that, the maintenance associated with that, you know, we see some benefit there related to not having to add that additional capacity. And then some of the categories, you know, they end up rating about the same. Again, the life cycle would be the other key piece I would point out, just related to thinking about the longer term look at this and the types of longer term improvements we would need to do. I see a couple questions coming in on the chat. If we want, we can pause real quick and take a couple of those questions, Robin.
Sure. I'd like to know more about the environmental justice component, equity and justice for lower income people in our community. In high school, my family lived in Blue Valley, and particularly my junior and senior years living below the poverty level. My stepdad and mom divorced and were striving to support us on our own. I'm mindful of how the toll lane might be experienced by people in our community who are struggling. I've been trying to do this and do some reading in this area, but I think that's we need to be prepared to address. And then Adam has to leave. So.
Oh, okay. Thank you,
so,
Adam, for joining us.
Yes. Well, and we've talked a little bit about that, Gretchen, and we do have, and Michael may put the fact sheet link in the chat so that we can see that as well.
Okay.
Do you have other comments on the environmental justice, Gretchen?
You know, the only thing I'd say is that, you know, we do have, you know, a pretty rigorous methodology we use to make sure we're not only in alignment with the way the federal, you know, federal guidance would say to do any analysis we're going to do for EJ. But we're also using the Mid-America Regional Council, the region's analysis methods for evaluating EJ. But we do think it is something that we definitely will be coming up with as we go further into the project, you know, thinking about, you know, any kind of mitigation strategies, or as we think about the express toll lanes, there might be the opportunity to still offer, you know, different pricing to kind of encourage transit use within that express lane concept. So there's things like that we can do. And the one other thing that we found with express lane projects kind of across the country is, you know, even though you're getting the highest speeds in that express toll lane option, we found that it still offers a benefit to all lanes of traffic. And so even if they choose not to use the express lanes, they would still get a benefit over doing, you know, over a no build, obviously, on this corridor, or even sometimes over, depending on how that general capacity turns out. And so we want to make sure that that as we plan our express lane and how we're going to have it operate, that we can offer that benefit across all lanes of traffic. And anything, Cameron or Lindsay, you would add to that as well?
I would just kind of, as an overall, and not just necessarily for the engineering and cost criteria, but as we look at all of the kind of categories in the environmental analysis, you know, there are going to be opportunities to identify improvements to whether it's environmental justice or other things that would make both the capacity being general purpose or capacity with the express managed lanes be improved and can kind of mitigate some of those impacts. So I think you want to, if you roll it up and you look at it overall, again, kind of how I started the whole meeting, and we've talked about in each of these segments, there are trade-offs. There is not going to be one thing that's going to do everything the way we want it. And so how do we pick the one thing, and we're not making that decision today, but as we continue this analysis, we want to hone in on the couple of options that get us as close as we can, and then look for other things that we can do to maybe offset some of that impact. But the rating is the first step to identify what looks best overall with the way that we're conceiving of it right now. And then we can go from there and continue to improve. But I think, you know, as when these results were kind of presented to KDOT as this rating and analysis was done, and the team was preparing this presentation for you all, I think a lot of the ratings and the conclusions coming out of this initial assessment made a lot of sense. Made a lot of sense with what we're hearing, made a lot of sense with some of the concerns that we're hearing. So I think this is very consistent. Nothing really jumped out at me as being, you know, a glaring question. So with that, I'll pause and see if there are questions or other comments.
There was one other question from Ron about, you know, there will be opportunities to incorporate elements from other strategies like transit and TSM and TDM into the preferred alternative, correct?
That is right. Yeah. I mentioned that a little earlier, but just to kind of reiterate that point, you know, even though we're narrowing down to these two alternatives to kind of carry forward and look at for analysis further because they best met purpose and need, that doesn't mean that we won't still be able to layer on some of those multimodal improvements or ITS traveler information type of improvements to the to the preferred or proposed action at the end of the day. So yes.
And will the impacts of the refined alternatives be reevaluated?
You mean
Like
once we do a combination?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, we will. So when we, right now, again, we're just kind of at that more kind of a more qualitative look with these ratings. And so we will definitely have that quantifiable impact information. And we will be, once we decide, because we're not quite to the point yet where we've said this is our proposed action. This is just kind of that next step in the screening at this point. But once we have that, yes, we will be looking at the comprehensive proposed action and evaluating its full impacts. Am I answering that question?
Yes, yeah, I think so. And then we just have a Menti to get your consensus, to understand your reactions to the engineering and cost criteria. Again, is number one is I agree with the conclusions and the ratings that are and they are what you expected. I agree with the conclusions, but would rank some differently. I do not agree, and I disagree with the ratings and other. And then I think we're going to kind of need to move on a little bit after this to get through the rest of the presentation.
Yeah, this will conclude our kind of look at the alternative screening after we're done with this Menti. And again, I guess while everybody's kind of rating, just next steps then is we will be taking this kind of information to our next public meeting to get the public's input on our alternatives and the screening process and some of the ratings that we've done. And if there's any of this criteria or methodology anybody wants to talk about after the meeting, let Cameron and Lindsay know, and we can get you any backup information you'd like to see.
Looks like the group generally agreed with the ratings on this one. So we'll move on to the next one.
Hand it over to Scott.
And Scott
Thanks,
Cooper
Robin.
will be up.
So now we're going to provide an update on our toll study, but more specifically, we want to talk about our traffic and revenue forecasting and some of the results we're seeing from that. But let's start by asking answering the question, why are we conducting the traffic and revenue study? Well, to achieve our goal of fully maximizing the facility by managing traffic with pricing, we need to determine what the appropriate toll rates will be. So answering the questions, what is the traffic today and tomorrow? Who will use the express lanes? What they're willing to pay will help us to establish the appropriate toll rates and forecast this demand to optimize the throughput. So in very simple terms, what is the lowest price we can charge to provide a reliable trip time? And by doing that, we hope to optimize the distribution of traffic between all the lanes of the facility. So the theory in price managed lanes of supply and demand is like in many of your businesses. We look for the intersection of those lines, that supply line and the demand line. In our case, the supply line is relatively fixed, right? We have 2 express lanes operating 24/7, but there are many factors that influence the demand. So an industry proven and widely accepted approach in the tolling industry is use stated preference surveys to help understand what the users are seeing and their reaction to facilities like this. And so we can more accurately predict what that demand will be. Next slide, Robin. So what's listed here are the necessary inputs that go into the traffic and revenue forecast. The top 3 bullets are items that we've already collected: the traffic counts, composition, the economic growth, specifically population and employment growth. I know there was a question earlier about forecasted land use, and so that is in those forecasts. And then there also were questions about who's using the facility and what the toll rates will be. And that's where we want to focus our time today, these last 2 items. And so Robin, if you want to go to the next slide. So we conducted this project-specific stated preference survey that was designed to maximize the insight of the potential US 69 users and to understand what was the reason for their specific trips, where did they begin and end those trips. And then we also presented the respondents with scenarios that were randomized to allow them to either choose an express lane or choose the free lane based on variable travel time savings, and toll rates. And so we'll show you the results of that here in a few slides. We also inquired about the trip frequency. And then obviously we've talked about COVID and the impacts of that on their travel. And then finally, demographics about the specific respondents. So in January, we mailed out over 10,000 postcards. We had several Facebook posts, email blasts, website links that led to a collection of over 2,500 survey attempts. And of those attempts, more than 1,600 were completed and deemed acceptable, which is quite remarkable. We were hoping to get 1,000, 1,100, and we received over 1,600. So we're very pleased with not only the numbers of the results, but the quality of the information we received. I also point out that of all the respondents, 95% came from within Johnson and Miami counties. And then also of all the respondents, over 50% were from Overland Park. Next slide. So we wanted to understand why people were taking their trips. And also because of COVID, we felt it was important to understand what they were doing pre and post COVID. And so for the purposes of this survey, March 2020 is what we're calling the COVID indicator. So pre-COVID is before March 2020 and post-COVID is after March 2020. And so this chart presents the summary of the results of why people are making their trips. And you can see that in the green bars, the pre-COVID results, in the blue or the post-COVID, we had about a 14% decrease in those commuting to and from work as a result of COVID. However, you'll see the leisure trips combined for about a 15% increase over the same period. Also, the frequency of the trips, we noticed that those taking more than 5 trips per week decreased about 7%. And then that 7% shifted to those that were taking between 1 and 5 trips per week. Next slide. Okay, thank you. So while the time frame to return to normal, I know we've talked about it here, and Cameron did, about what does normal look like? When do we return to normal? Well, I'm not convinced that normal is a definable term anymore, right? What is normal? But what we do see is people expect to return to life prior to COVID in some form or fashion. And these charts indicate the current work arrangements pre-COVID and what they expect moving forward. So the yellow on this chart, for example, indicates an individual working 4 or more days per week remotely. And you can see today that's about 43% of the total respondents. And when asked, how do they see their future work arrangements, that number drops to 11%, which is quite encouraging. And in fact, just yesterday, Google announced that they're going to start a transition back to the office between now and the fall. And then I believe it's September 1. After September 1, only with prior approval, they're going to allow a person to work remotely no more than 14 days per year. So I think you're going to see that these numbers are going to bounce around. And then as we proceed into the summer and the fall, they're going to change. In terms of the origins and destinations of the trips, we asked people to describe where they were beginning their trips and ending their trips. And so what this pie chart shows is just that, the origin and or destination of all the reported trips. And so while they're diverse in nature, they're overwhelmingly local trips. And I think Cameron even mentioned when he opened up this morning that over half of the trips either begin or end in Overland Park. And that's what's shown in that 49% of the half of the pie there. The map on the right is just a plot of all of these origins and destinations. And again, you can see the heavy concentration of all of these trips along the US 69 corridor. And in fact, when we tallied the trips and looked at each specific one, the median trip length was about 10 miles, but over 5 of those miles for each trip was along US 69. So without question, the majority of the respondents to this survey are using 69 today. So we asked several random questions in the survey that allowed the users to select whether they would use the regular lanes or the express lanes under these various time savings and toll rates. And that gives us insight into their not only willingness to choose the express lanes, but what they would be willing to pay in selecting the express lanes. And this graph shows those results. So the vertical axis represents the number of people that selected the express lane option with the corresponding rate that's shown along the x-axis. So in other words, at 5 cents, 43% of all respondents said they would choose the express lane over the free lane. But as that toll rate per mile increased to 50 or 60 cents per mile, you can see the total number of respondents selecting the express lanes dropped to about 13%. And I want to highlight the green and the blue lines because I know there were questions earlier about this. The blue line represents the respondents' household incomes of less than 50,000, while the green line represents the respondents' results for those household incomes above 200,000. And so you can see that, as expected, those with a higher household income chose the express lane option more frequently for the same toll rates. But also I want to point out the survey revealed that there was no major opposition to tolling based on income levels. It's relative within household incomes, but we didn't see disparity between the option to use the lane or not use the lane based on that. Overall, about a third of the respondents said they're just opposed to paying toll. They didn't care where they're going or how much time they would save. They're just opposed to paying a toll. On the other hand, over a third indicated their willingness to select the express lane and pay a toll. And it's really good news because we only have a third of the capacity of the facility dedicated for express lanes. And then also as a point of reference, let me draw your attention to what's shown in purple, the small numbers here. And these are the national averages for publicly operated express lanes of the minimum cost per mile, which is 11 cents. And then the maximum cost per mile is about 56 cents. And so our results fell right in the limits of those currently operating facilities, mins and maximums. So where do we go from here? The next advisory group meeting is going to be the one you'll want to attend, right? I think Lindsay expressed earlier that we'll be sharing with you the toll rates, and I know that's on everybody's mind. What are the toll rates? But also next time we'd like to spend a few minutes explaining, how you use the express lanes, where you can get in and get out, how we will suggest pricing the segments, and how segments are then used to build a trip price. So we'd like to reveal all of that at the next advisory group meeting after we've had an opportunity to fully synthesize the results of these stated preference surveys. Then also we'll present the cost of the various options and what those phasing options look like. And then as a teaser, you can see the sign here on the right. We'll be able to share what the roadside messaging looks like, so users will know what they will see on the highway and how they'll know whether to make the decision to enter the express lane or not.
So we'll pause there and take some questions before we move on. Julie's got her hand raised. So Julie, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, this is a little bit around the line of some of the questions I've been seeing in the chat as far as the impact on toll on different populations. And I appreciate the census tract data will be very helpful and something that actually folks can find right now out on the UCS website, because we've just updated all our census tract data, interactive maps that the county works with us on. But we've got that, which is my lived experience in where I'm residing. But we also know that for many different job classifications that somebody who may be of lower income may be engaged in, may be a transportation type job, i.e. a Lyft driver, an Uber driver, other types of delivery drivers, where maybe part of their compensation is based on how quickly I can get from point A to point B, which would incentivize me to use the toll, but may diminish my earnings because I'm paying out of pocket to use the toll. I don't know if you have data on, especially like an Uber, Lyft, and those types of companies, if there's anything they do to offset those toll costs for their drivers so that they can keep passengers, i.e. the paying and tipping customers, satisfied and happy that they're getting from point A to point B expediently. Does all that make sense? I got too lazy. I didn't want to try to type it all into
I appreciate that.
Certainly. And I know several places around the country, I'll be charged the actual toll on my Uber bill, right? So when I make that trip selection and they're going to route me through a toll facility, I as a user will be charged those rates. Maybe not so much as with a delivery driver. That's a little bit different. If someone is just a single operator that's conducting deliveries, if they have the opportunity to pass it on the consumer, they might, but in other cases, they may not have that ability directly.
Food delivery solutions have increased, as have personal shopper solutions have been on the rise, and you're thinking of folks who may be populating those jobs and what those income levels may look like. And this being such a main artery in our community, what that impact could look like.
That's a good question, Julie. Clint had another question about, could we subsidize the toll for those making under 50,000, or does that defeat the purpose of a less populated toll lane?
It's not unheard of. It has been done before. I think under limited use, it's not going to defeat the purpose unless the program is designed to where it can be abused or so widely available that you're exceeding the allowable capacity of the facility. I wouldn't foresee that happening, but that would be a possible a possible downside of that is if the program was very generous and widely distributed.
Maybe one other thing to just add there would be, KTA, as they have their K-tag and other, electronic toll tag usage, they do have some partnerships with things like a bank pass that at least allows for some cash payments and preloading of cards to better manage, some situations for low income users so that they can back things by cash if they don't want to use credit. It's not necessarily a discount program, but there are some programs and some partners out there like a bank pass that kind of help, address some of the needs of lower income populations as they use toll facilities. And so that might be helpful here to kind of explore as we get further into the project.
Yeah. And it's also helpful that even the K-tag is effectively a post-paid account. So a person can have a K-tag account with zero cost of entry to getting one, just maintaining it on a post-paid basis, and then they would receive the discounted K-tag rate over a video rate.
Other questions on the toll information that Scott presented?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I've got one more, and that was just related to this is more of an engineering thing, but these express lane signs, sometimes the distance between them, if the toll might change somewhere between the two, so that one might say 10 cents, and then by the time you get to the next one, it's higher because of time or other, and spacing, because in this particular area of the highway, Speed limit's what, 65 all the way through that whole area, and most people travel at about 74, you know, just below where the police come out and stop you.
Yeah, Clint, so good questions. And let me start with the latter first. We do install the signs in accordance with the manual on uniform traffic control devices, and they have an entire chapter now on express lanes and how to properly sign those with adequate spacing, you know, for entry and exit locations. But then also on the first question, which is a very good question, there is a provision that allows us to locate these pricing signs relatively close to the entry points to the express lanes. And then also immediately after the entry point is where we would ideally like to locate the toll collection equipment, so we can, you know, identify the vehicle traveling through the lane at that location. So it minimizes the distance between the sign and that toll collection location. But we also built in, or will build in, time delays with the transaction. So whatever the sign says, we build in delays after that rate changes to another rate. So we know that if a person is traveling at very low speeds, we give more than ample time for a car to pass the sign and pass the toll location to ensure they're charged the rate that they saw when they drove under the sign.
Thank you.
So to say it another way, if you enter at one price, you're not going to get charged a higher price on exit that you didn't see because of the way the operations and the prices come into play.
Julie, did you have another question, or is your hand still up from before?
Sorry, still up from.
Just making sure. Okay, we want to move on. Appreciate all the questions and everything. Robin, you want to take us through this?
So we're just going to be wrapping up here and, you know, talking about some of our engagement and what we've been hearing from the public as we've, you know, put a lot of information out there. You know, in terms of social media, we're on Nextdoor. KDOT has a page on Nextdoor, and we have dedicated pages on Facebook and Twitter, a Twitter account that we're have information, and we're developing our following on all of those. Nextdoor has a great following. And we've gotten lots of good discussion with the neighborhoods along 69 and what people feel like about tolling. You know, there are people for and against, and nobody's shy about sharing their opinion. And just yesterday, in fact, we had pushed out some information about how express toll lanes work, and somebody commented that they have something similar in Dallas, and when we went through it with our camper in Galveston, we used the express toll lane. It was worth every penny, and they would use 69 express lanes every chance they get. So there are people out there that are supportive of this in the area, and we're hearing from them on the different platforms that we're using. So we're also doing a campaign to expand our followers on Facebook. And so if you want to friend that or follow the Facebook page, that would be great. That's, you know, it's at US 69 Express Kansas on Facebook, and the same on Twitter too. You know, share with your networks. We post generally every day on that, and then you can just share that with your following and get that information out there as well. And then, you know, into other updates that we're doing, you know, we've been doing community briefings with different organizations, and we have several scheduled now and into the future. Like last week, Lindsay did one with the Lions Club. We've updated marked the highway, the transportation committee and the highway committee. We've briefed Representative Davids and Senator Marshall, and both of them, you know, they understand the express tolling concepts, particularly because they live and work in DC, and they are generally supportive of the project, and we're working with them regularly and keeping them updated, and they're very interested in how this project is moving forward. And these are just some of the other things that we've heard on social media. You know, there are people out there that aren't interested in tolling and don't want tolling in Johnson County. And they ask, they're like, well, what are we using our gas tax for? We pay enough taxes in Johnson County. We do not need a toll lane. There are some people that are asking, hey, hopefully it's compatible with KTAG. And then people wondering if the decision's already been made. And then people that do want tolling. So I think that there's lots of varying opinions out there, and you know, and we're responding to those questions with information that we have on the website, and as well as responding to their questions and concerns. So, and then
If I
just,
could-
oh yeah, go ahead, Lindsay.
on that, Robin, if I could just add specifically to, you know, whether or not the decision's already been made. I just want to emphasize with this group as leaders in the community that we've engaged to kind of advise us on this project. We want to take in as much, you know, feedback and input that you would have, as well as the public, you know, through our public meetings and kind of talking to them about the different concepts. We certainly have not made any decision, even with the information that has been presented today. I think the next meeting, we're going to have a lot to talk about, and we're continuing to answer these questions and respond to these comments that we get in this engagement effort. So just, you know, if you get questions from people and you want to send them to us, or you want to forward their question and want us to respond through you, that's just fine. We want to be talking with and answering as many of these questions and providing information as much as we can with folks. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. If folks want a presentation, if you'd rather put us in the middle, happy to take that on as well. So, you know, please keep us apprised if there's anything we can be doing to support you and your role in the community, as well as your role on the advisory group.
Thanks, Lindsay. And then our next slide is just the schedule. We are meeting again in 2 weeks, where we're going to cover additional information on April 13th. So you'll be seeing us again quickly. And then again at the beginning of May. So we have a couple more meetings planned. And then we have newsletters that we're going to be continually sending out. Those go out about every 2 weeks. We'll be doing council briefings by wards to meet with them individually to talk through their questions and concerns. We do have another public meeting scheduled, and that will be April 20th for the live virtual meeting online. And then the open house style virtual meeting will be open for about 2 weeks around that date. We'll be doing an additional ETC survey right after the public meeting, and an additional focus group the beginning of May to understand, you know, where people are and what their concerns are. And we'll have those final results in mid-May. We continually do community presentations. We have some scheduled with the Rotary and with the Chamber coming up in April. And so, and we will continually schedule those for any groups that are interested and contact us. And we're reaching out to others to solicit those as well. And then we'll be looking for kind of a decision recommendation toward the end of May moving forward. Cameron, do you have anything else you want to add on that?
I mean, I think you covered it, but you can see this is good. We're moving into a period that'll be a pretty busy couple of months here as we work through a lot of things here over the course of April and May, and we're excited about that. And we kind of look forward to increasing our frequency of being in front of you guys with new information and getting feedback from all of you. And it's extremely valuable, the information that you guys provide and the questions that you ask and the commentary and everything on what we're presenting here. So we just really appreciate your guys' willingness to be part of this advisory group, and we really do value your input, and we'll be back here in just a couple of weeks.
So with that, we're done with the formal portion of the agenda and all the information that we've been sharing with you. So this is a good time to wrap up answer any additional questions that you all have. If you feel we didn't address something earlier, let's cover it here. We've got about 10 minutes left for those of you that can continue to hang with us. Clint, are you sure you don't have a question?
This is
Yes,
Fred Spears. I don't have a question, but the Bank of KDOT apparently has had a lot of withdrawals over the last few years. And when I explain that to citizens, they get a little upset because they're usually complaining about all the trash on 435 or 69. And Lindsay and I have talked about that. When I explain that to them, it doesn't pour oil on the water per se, so they just get more upset. So that's just a comment that I've been getting from a lot of folks in the community when I talk about this, or just the interstate system. Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
you know, to kind of comment real briefly, and I know we've worked up a few videos kind of responding to some of these questions. The issue of, hey, we already pay gas tax. Why do we have to pay, you know, a toll now? I think, you know, understanding part of the information that we rolled out today, it's become less and less about a local contribution and more about congestion management. And the local contribution aspect of it from a KDOT programmatic standpoint, we certainly want local communities to have skin in the game. And listen, Overland Park, you're not alone. Johnson County is not alone. Topeka has committed $20 million to Polk Quincy. Wichita and Sedgwick County contributed $30 million to North Junction. This is not a new concept, and it's not a new thing for communities to engage with us and partner. It gets more done. It gets you on the timeline that you want for your community, and it allows us to build the project sooner for you all. But now, you know, as we've gotten into some of this analysis, it really is going to help manage the congestion over the long term. And I think, and Fred, maybe you could provide some feedback to me. One of the things that I've talked about in some of these community meetings is I don't think Overland Park as a community wants 11 lanes bisecting their city. And I know that's not 11 like lanes all the way through. It's smaller down south because there's less traffic. But even, you know, as you get up towards I-30 or 135th Street and Blue Valley Parkway, when you start looking at an 11-lane facility and the footprint that would, you know, bisect the town with, I just don't know that that is something that folks want. And that's what we would have to build to accommodate the same amount of traffic. So I'm trying to, you know, as we're working on this value proposition and really putting that information together, I'm trying to give more tools to think about the managed lane in a way that's more than just a revenue generation, that could really be best for the size of the facility that you want in your community.
Thank you, Lindsay. You're right. Nobody wants 11 lanes going through here. When we expanded 435 a number of years ago, there were a lot of complaints about we don't need that much road, but that was from the people who don't use it. And as far as contributing, we've always been more than happy to contribute what we can to improve the whole transportation network for our folks. So,
yep.
I'm just happy we're having this conversation and looking at all the different options so we can choose the best approach. And hopefully, and I talked to Suze Parker about this a long time ago, the communication is just absolutely critical on this, on how we provide it and what's said and get all the questions answered. So people have a fuller understanding than what we do now. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And we, you know, at KDOT, we really appreciate the partnership of the city. We've worked together on a number of really great improvements for the community and for the region and for the transportation system overall. So that partnership is critical, and we're working really hard to provide as much information and communicate early and often as folks want to vote, right? Early and often.
Yes. And just one quick comment. I remember specifically when we had a last 69 project, and at that point, Vice President Biden did a ribbon cutting, and it was quite the event. What was humorous was all the Republicans in the crowd rushed up to have their picture taken with him at the time. So maybe we can get him out here and get some federal money from what he proposed.
Heck yeah, let's do it again. I like it.
It would
Thank you.
It would sound like from the early interviews and polling we did that the citizens would prefer we go all the way down to 179th if there's going to be some federal money, but to get it all done at the same time. But Lindsay, I did want to, I know we kind of went over this quickly and Cameron and I have been talking about it. it's not a definitive type of thing, but again, considering the smarts in the voters and so on, and Greg Musil might have a comment about this because he was on the city council for a while. I don't want to overlook the data point that half of the traffic that's on 69 is not in Overland Park, Kansas. And as to whether they would all choose to take the toll or not, that is one talking point with people, that a portion of this toll is going to be paid by non-residents. And I think that has served us well in the past with things like retail sales tax and some other things. So it's not going to be a huge point, and there probably isn't going to be specific data, but it is obvious that a whole lot of other folks other than our taxpayers are using that road. And I think we want to keep that in our quiver as one of our smaller, lower tier talking points.
Just if we can't get workers to Johnson County and Overland Park, we can't provide the services and employment opportunities you want. So, and the tax base suffers and everything else. So I agree with Mary's point, as always.
And Greg, did you want to mention, ask your question about the survey slide?
Well, yeah, well, my only question was, when I took the survey, I was a little disappointed because I was supposed to tell you about my last trip on 69 highway, right? Well, that was on a Saturday to visit my daughter, and I went from 135th to 103rd. Well, I don't need an express lane for that now, and I probably won't need that in the future. So I'm trying to figure out if you could slice and dice the survey information to get to those who really use it when it is most needed, and the express lane would be most beneficial, which are AM and PM peaks. And I know those are going to grow over time as traffic grows. But can you break that down? Because my response was, to me, absolutely irrelevant to what we're talking about.
That is a good point. I might throw that to either Scott or Yagnish actually, to see, as we look at the respondents to the survey, they were asked to sort kind of what their trip purpose was. So Greg, I assume you marked, some sort of personal purpose to the trip and not a work commute trip or something like that would have fallen in the peak period. I would imagine we could sort that. Now, whether we can glean from that a different propensity to pay the toll or not, that'd be maybe a more detailed question for Scott.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We have from the results, not only, the origin destination, but with over a 24-hour period within the hour of when all of the respondents indicated their trip was made, along with days. So we have all of that information that we can slice and dice, because that goes into, the weekend trips are helpful to understand what is the demand on the weekend, because when we're looking at forecasting revenue, we look at revenue days per year. And so it's not 365, it's a fraction of that, because while a weekend is not a full weekday, it is a portion that does get some credit, because we recognize it will be used on some occasions. So we certainly have that information.
Now, my thought was, if you had 1,600 responses, which is great, I don't know how many of those would have come from a time when you would seriously have to consider whether or not to get into the express lane.
Right.
That was my only point.
All right. Well, I again would like to thank everybody for participating. We're at 12:59, so I think we'll call it good, and appreciate it. See you all in 2 weeks, and thanks again so much for your active participation and your great questions. And Clint, thank you for all your questions. I appreciate it, and sorry I didn't mean to call you out like that on the questions. So we appreciate it, and see you again in 2 weeks.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.